Hey, how's it going? It's Grant with the Garden of Eater, and in this video, we're going to show you we finally built our dream stand. I'm talking 110-gallon tanks on one rack, and we did it all for Neocaridina, Caridina, and even some of Shelby's fish. So like every project, this one started out at Home Depot. We had to get some 2x4s, and once again, the price has gone up. This video is a little bit old. We did this quite some time ago, but for once, we're gonna go through, show you the entire build cycle and us adding the shrimp into the tanks. But we went to Home Depot this time, and they were $7.75. And at $7.75 a 2x4, you darn right I'm gonna be picky. So I went through and made sure none of them were bent or curved to the point where I couldn't straighten them out, and none of them had bad notches or splits. And the wood was my first step because I wanted to start gathering up all the supplies that I needed. After I got some of the wood, it was time to start taking out the old racks. Now that the old racks were out of the way, and by the way, we got rid of the old racks because they were built in a time when we were just not ready to expand to the level that we're at now. So they were great for the time period when we built them. However, we just need more room. So more tanks in one area, the better. And 10 gallons are the perfect size for breeding shrimp without getting too small and going too large, because we just simply couldn't fit 70, 75-gallon tanks here. And I really wanted 100 tanks on this rack. But with that rack gone, Shelby can finally get rid of those mustard yellow walls. She went through, painted it a nice green, new trim, siliconed everything in, and got everything primed and ready for the new rack to go in its spot. So then we cut all of the wood outside in the garage, and once all of it was cut, we brought it all inside and assembled the entire rack. And basically what we did was we built the same exact stand that we built in Layla's and Jaden's room, but we went up an extra level, almost going on the entire way across, but not quite. And then once we got the four walls done, we were able to brace them all together. And in the middle of the two stands, we basically did a band-aid and filled in the gaps with two 2x4s, structured everything up so that way we can go 5 rows high, 22 tanks on each row on the first 4, and then the top row holds 12 tanks. And also, I got to give big thanks to Shelby and Eddie for helping me out. Eddie came by and helped me put together all the walls and stand them up, band-aid the entire rack together. Without him, it would have been a real struggle for me and Shelby to get that done. Probably would have had to have an extra hand anyways. But without the two of you guys, I wouldn't have ever been able to get this monster of a rack done. And since we built the entire stand inside, we're gonna have to sand and paint the tank inside as well. Of course, it's so massive that we can't fit it through any of the doors without taking it apart. So hopefully we don't have to do that anytime soon. But if we ever wanted to move, yeah, I'd have to basically take the stand apart in two, move it around back to go out the house. But I'm gonna have to worry about that when we come to that later on down the road. We did a very light standing inside with the windows and doors open, and luckily we have lids on almost all the tanks, so we didn't really have to worry about sawdust or anything like that. And then we did 2 coats of primer. We had to lift the tank stand on its side to paint the bottoms. That was more of a hassle than we thought. I had to have Eddie and one of my other friends come back to the house to help us lift up the stand to do that part. But any of the tanks that didn't have lids on them, we had Aquachar on by, because any of the fumes from the paint can be kind of strong enough to make the shrimp go lethargic or even cause deaths in the tank. So any of the tanks that were nearby that didn't have lids on them, we threw in some Aquachar just as a preventative to stop that from happening in the first place. But 2 coats of primer, and then we did 2 coats of the top coat, which is an oil-based black semi-gloss. And make sure you want to do oil-based when painting the tank stands. Those are going to make them as waterproof as possible. And usually it takes us about 3 days to get a tank stand entirely primed and painted, but this one took 3 days per coat. And that's when we realized just how massive of a stand this really was. And being in the shrimp hobby for 9 years now, we've built quite a few tank stands before in the past, and we've learned a little bit from each one, and we've found a way to make each tank stand a little bit nicer. And for this stand, I gotta give all the credit to Shelby. She wanted to go through and paint all of the PVC for the closed loop air system black. So we went outside, cut all the PVC pipe, and painted that outside before we went inside this time. And another thing, this tank stand is so massive that this is the largest closed loop air system that we've done besides the one outside. So for inside, everything before has been 3/4 inch PVC, but for this one, because it's a 110-gallon tanks, we went ahead and did 1 inch. And also, if you want to check out our previous rack builds or our closed loop air system, check that out in the description down below. And then one last real difference that we made to this rack compared to the ones we've done in the past is before I left enough gap in the bottom of the rack, about 6 inches or so, for easy cleaning access to get any of the toys or anything like that. We got 2 to 4 dogs at any given point with all the racks in our house, so dog hair, we sweep a lot, making it really easy with that gap on the bottom. However, we didn't really have the roof clearance that we had this time, and I had a little wiggle room, but not as much as I had before. So I decided to go through and just have the bottom row sitting straight on the 2x4s going horizontal across, so that way all of the weight on the bottom row was sitting right on the 2x4s that are horizontal on the floor and not on the vertical beams that are holding up the rest of the rack. And then when I was talking about supplies, I should have mentioned that the $1 per gallon sale started like at the perfect time for us to start building this rack. However, they were horribly undersupplied because we went to every single Petco from here to Tampa Airport all the way to Orlando, and we came up short. I think we only got a total of, Shelby will put the right number up here somewhere, but I think it was like 68 brand new tanks. The rest we had to use used tanks from the old rack setup, some of the old ones that we had in the garage from old projects, old Florida State Fair tanks, and then we had also purchased all of the tanks from Steve, the Florida South Shrimper, who got out of the hobby. Check out that link in the description down below. But we had 15 of those tanks, and I had almost forgotten about those until Shelby was like, "What is this handwriting? This is way nicer than your handwriting. Whose handwriting is this?" And I was like, "Huh, what is it?" And then I was like, "It's a Boost. Like it's got," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, we bought all of Steve's tanks." So because we couldn't buy all brand new tanks, we ended up using some used tanks. So I'll go through exactly and what rows we did here in a second. And now that the tank stand is finally done and in its spot, it's time to put the tanks on the rack itself. And to start off with the bottom row, we're going to do an entire row of just Neocaridina. We're going to use the Samurai soil, tap water, prime to take out the chlorine, and just a little bit of bacteria and fertilizer to get the cycle going. And then the second row is going to be all of the old used soil tanks that we already had sitting in the garage. And this is where things start to get crazy because we really wanted to go through and utilize this new rack for a lot of projects, not just breeding projects, but testing out different substrates, testing out different test kits. A lot of different things are going into this rack. And by projects, I also mean experiments as well. Some of these tanks have been in the garage for quite some time, 3 to 4 months, even longer, where I left some water in the tanks so that way the substrate wouldn't dry out. However, some just dried out bare bone all the way, and we kind of wrote on the tanks which tanks dried out all the way, so we can keep track because it was told to me a while ago that if the substrate dries out, it can become brittle, weak, break down, and this will affect its pH buffering ability. So we've done a couple tests already. So far, all of the tanks that we set up in the garage, even the ones that dried all the way down to bare bottom, have indeed held up their buffering capability through 2 water changes so far. Now, is that going to keep up? Will they quickly deplete themselves after a couple more water changes? It's one of those experiments that I'm going to go through, follow up, and do a part 2 video or something like that, an update on the different effects that the pH had from drying out or just sitting out over the years. Some of these tanks are 6 or 7 years old and they're still buffering down below 6 pH. It was really cool to test out some of these tanks with different test kits, because before in the past we've only used API test kits, and now we have a Sierra test kit and it goes below 6 pH. So it's really interesting to see some of the old tanks with Brightwell, ADA, Shrimp King that are well over 4 years old that are still buffering below 6 pH. And then moving on to the third row, again, we've got 12 more used tanks. So we used up 36 of our old tanks that were just sitting in the garage. 15 of those were from Steven's house, but they all hold well. Only one of the tanks is buffering at 6.5, and we're going to go through and use those for tiger shrimp, so it's not a loss. Also, some of the shrimp tanks were rather mummified, whether it was from having too much alder cones or cholla wood, Indian almond leaves, or something breaking down, or just overfeeding. Whatever the issue was, I went through, did the best job I could with taking a big 2-liter soda bottle, cutting the bottom off, electrical taping it onto the end of the hose, and just really slowly going through and pulling out as much mull as I can. And I know it grabbed a lot of the soil dust and whatnot. However, it did leave back behind the big granules of substrate, and that's what I wanted. Some of the tanks really cleaned up nicely. The ones that didn't, well, I sacrificed those and gave those to Shelby and her fish. And then the next 10 tanks, well, those are all Fluval substrate. Yeah, I know some of you might be cringing right now, going, oh, it's Fluval. Well, I saw a commercial, it's Fluval, so I'm sticking with it. However, we entered the Fluval Scape Contest at the Orlando Aquashella, and they gave you a couple bags of the substrate to go with the contest, and you didn't have to use it if you didn't want to. I think we did use it for some of the pockets of substrate underneath some of the plants that were growing underneath the bottom for nutrients. However, I did come home with like 3 or 4 bags of it, and I was like, I'm setting up a new tank stand. This is perfect timing. So we ended up using it. I know there's a lot of negative feedback with Fluval substrate. A lot of people will say it doesn't buffer very well or at all. So I'm going to go through and give it a very fair chance. I'm going to compare it to quite some other heavy hitter substrates, including our very true and going on for like 4 to 6 years now, where we've just been using Brightwell substrate. There was a little issue on getting as much substrate as we needed. I said, hey, why not go through and test out some other substrates? It'd be the perfect time. But the first one on our list is the Fluval, and I'm going through making sure it's getting 0 KH RO water and then GH only minerals, so that way the buffering capability of that soil is going to be at maximum efficiency, and we're going to see if it can go on to 6 months to a year or even longer, like some of these other tanks have been kicking for us so far. Now, when we started to fill up this row, we found not 1 but 2 really sweet surprises. So going along, 1 tank at a time, starting to fill up the tanks. Now, mind you, some of the tanks were completely dry. Some of them had a little bit of water in them. But filling up the tank, I'm starting to see movement, and I'm going, oh my God, Shelby, there's still shrimp in this tank. Now, we identified them as Stardust, and I recognize this tank. It's one of the tanks that we got from Steven. It was just jam-packed with Stardust. I had it on the living room floor for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and Shelby's going, are you ever going to get this tank off my floor? And I'm just going, I'm still catching babies. And finally, I went like 2 or 3 days where I couldn't find anything anymore. So I said, all right, move the tank into the garage with all the other ones. Well, sure enough, 4 shrimp must have been deep down in the substrate or just so tiny that I couldn't see them. They ended up living through and growing up, and it's been so long since I've started this video and filmed and doing the voiceover that, well, I even have 2 of them pregnant. So the shrimp have been in the garage over winter through some really hot months as well, with less than like half an inch of water, and still survived and still have healthy enough reproductive organs to reproduce. So that was just our first surprise. And it just so happens that the very next tank, we got our next surprise. And Shelby couldn't believe me because we are known for having a lot of shrimp. Not so much for the fish. So this surprise caught us both really off guard because looking into the next tank, I see a little tiny fry. Baby fish, can't really identify it. Going through, figure out which tank it was. Remembered we had some fish in there. I tell Shelby, we've got a baby Achilles. She doesn't believe me. And sure enough, it grew up to size. It's definitely identified as Achilles fish, but that's not even the end of it. The first one, baby, it was in there. Must have been an egg that hatched, baby that didn't get eaten by the parents and was just growing up, lack of food. Just didn't grow up big enough for us to see it when we drained the tank. However, 2 more babies have since hatched out of eggs. Don't know where the eggs were in the substrate or whatever, but we do have 3 Achilles fish in that tank still. So, I mean, that was just such a huge surprise. And it really, I believe that finding those fish really got Shelby going on the whole fish craze, because since then she's been feeding everything twice a day and really trying and going all in on breeding her Achilles fish especially. And then we've got 2 more Fluval tanks. I know, why didn't I just group them all together and make it all easier? Why didn't I just put them at the end? Yada, yada, yada. It's because the way the layout is, we're actually building, I don't know if you noticed the tanks behind us, if you haven't seen the live streams that we're doing on Mondays, well, you know, this is kind of one wall of a room that we're building inside our living room. We've got the fireplace where our TV will be mounted on, and our microphone and laptop and all of our shipping supplies and everything will go on that wall. We'll even put a couple of nice scape tanks in front of the window. But then the other wall is the 110-gallon tank stand that we are talking about right now. And then, yes, crazy enough, we're going to build yet another tank stand. We are well past the time when everything's set up and cycled and whatnot when we're filming all this. So the very next thing, we're already buying tanks because it is $1 per gallon sale going on yet again. The price of 2x4s have gone down to $4.99. So we're going to go ahead. Final wall, 4th wall is going to be 90 more 10-gallon tanks. So if we weren't crazy enough, we got 303 tanks currently in the house right now. When the 2 walls are finished, it'll put us right at 400 tanks. And then after the 2 Fluval tanks, we've got 3 UNS tanks. This substrate is very similar to Brightwell, so we're going to go through and give this one a fair test amongst the rest. And then, of course, what's not a competition without an underdog? And this isn't like any ordinary underdog. It shouldn't even be an underdog. However, it did have, you know, kind of a crutch to it, an unfair chance or an unfair advantage, if you might say. When Kevin Kelly came down and did his hardscape demonstration for a Pasco Aquarium Club, he left behind a little bag of substrate. I cut that thing, well, he cut that thing open to use it, and it's been sitting for quite some time. And I didn't even seal it up or anything like that, because when he handed it to me, it had already been open for, you know, a little bit, so I wasn't worried about keeping it fresh or anything like that. It is a like partial bag of Tropica substrate. I did look into buying this substrate. It is still kind of expensive here in the United States. I do like the most bang for your buck, and being that Brightwell substrate is $70 for 23 pounds, it didn't really make sense to buy these smaller bags for like $40 per bag. So with that in mind, I'm only doing 1 Tropica test, but it was a little dried out. But if it survives that test, maybe it's worth the little extra penny. And then moving on to uncharted territory, we've got the 5th row. Of course, the high ceilings in our living room have allowed this compared to the bedrooms in our house that just don't have this room. We've gone and done 12 tanks up top. The first tank is platinum substrate. I got that from my buddy Chaz at Elevate Shrimp. And This is something we haven't tried before. It is a brown in color. Shelby kind of wanted everything as organized as possible. So on the second row, we kind of have 4 old Brightwell Cafe tanks set up, but the top row, we're going to do alt brown, and to start it off, we've got the platinum substrate. And then we've got 10 tanks of substrate that we've never used before. However, it's quite common in Europe. There's quite a few good shrimpers that are breeding shrimp with it here in the United States already, but it's more commonly known as a bonsai substrate. It is a Kedama. It's brown, but it still does the buffering capability that we need to breed the Caridina shrimp, and we're quite excited to be trying it out. And I'll be honest, I thought that I'd have enough bonsai substrate to do all 11 of the end tanks, but I was short 1 substrate for the last tank. And of course, the best bang for your buck is Brightwell, and we wanted to stay with just brown. And in order to buy just 1 bag of the bonsai soil, it actually would have been more expensive. So we went back with the Brightwell, and Shelby wants to do something special with this tank. I don't think we're ever gonna do any water changes on this tank. We might do some top offs, because before we built the lids, it evaporated just a little bit. However, we're gonna let this thing cycle, no water changes on it, and we're probably gonna throw some super hardy shrimp in it. But Shelby swears that, you know, the tanks do a lot better when we're a lot busier and not able to do as many water changes as I like to do. I think there's an argument there, but it's an experiment, and you know, we've got 100 tanks to play with. What's 1 for no water changes? So like I mentioned, this video has taken us quite some time to get done. I actually broke my phone on Mother's Day, lost a lot of the footage trying to transfer everything over, but we're gonna fill in the gaps the best we can. And I felt it was just better to go through and get as much of the shrimp and fish into the tanks as we possibly can. We've got a couple of events coming up, so I didn't want to fill up all the tanks. I wanted to leave some empty in case we found some things that we had to bring home. And chances are, between Shelby and myself, we're gonna want to bring home a couple of things. So empty tanks are a great thing to have. So the entire rack isn't set up, but I'd say probably 90% of it has a bunch of different shrimp in it. We actually spent probably more money on the entire livestock that went into the rack rather than the rack itself, where usually we spend a lot more money on the rack because we stock it with all of our own shrimp. But a couple of people were getting out of the hobby, a couple of people were downsizing, and I bought shrimp from too many people to do an unboxing video. So real quickly, we're just gonna do a bunch of music over the plop and drops of all the shrimp. We didn't plop and drop them, but they were acclimated, put into the cup, and then dropped into the tank. So here's that now. Also, forgot to mention the lighting system that we used. We went through, looked online, Amazon, eBay, trying to find the cheapest system to use. We could have built something a little bit cheaper. However, time was just whooping our butts. We're trying to play catch up with everything. So I went through and just bought lights rather than making them. We went ahead and sourced the cheapest ones that we could find that were still full spectrum LEDs. We wanted LEDs so that way they were cheap and we weren't really going to have rust issues or anything like that. So we found some beamwork lights with timers built in. They're like $107 when we bought a group of them. So it was the cheapest thing that we could go through. We had the notches cut in just like the rack we did in Layla's room, and everything came out really nice. I still have to go through and make little spacers to level out all the lights. Just hadn't have enough time, but eventually I'll get through and everything will look nice and flush. And then of course, you don't want to put the lights on the tanks without lids. We had to buy some big sheets, 4-foot by 8-foot of the double polycarbonated panels, or Lexan plastic, whatever you want to call them. But they are a little bit thicker and they don't bend in the light or humidity or heat or anything like that. So we've had them going for quite some time. Some people tape up the holes. We haven't had any issues with algae buildup inside them or anything like that. However, we did find that bringing all of the panels over to Shelby's dad's house and cutting them on the table saw made things a lot easier, a lot quicker. We didn't make enough for all 100 tanks, but we were short like 6 or so. And because we're going to build the new tank stand, we'll go through, buy a couple more sheets, some extra ones, and I mean, the tank stands and that already have lids, some of the lids aren't that nice, so I might even go through and make some extra lids go through the house, because the ones that Shelby and her dad made are a lot nicer than the ones I made with the little skill saw. And I know we've gone through and tested all the tanks. However, that is going to be its own video on its own. Shelby's going to go through and she's going to give you her recommendations on what she thinks are the best test kits, the best way to go about finding your parameters, and the easiest method, because we tried some of them only take 5 minutes, some of them were taking 20 minutes. So she's going to go through, give you all the info, so that way you don't have to go in, spend your money and finding out that that's not the right test kit for you. And the best thing about this rack, and the reason why we set up 22 tanks for Neos, the rest for Caridina, is we're going to go through and do as many varieties as we possibly can for species spotlight videos. We want to go through, do more educational, tutorial videos. We haven't had time to do that lately, but we're going to get to it more often. So that's basically going to be it for this video. Unless you're upset that I forgot to talk about the sponge filters, well, the filtration, they're sponges connected to the closed loop air system. Link in the description below. Thank you, Shelby. But everything else is all going to be left to your imagination. I don't put up my specs or measurements or anything like that. I'm not an engineer. I'm all right at math, but you know, if everything came falling, crashing down on us, well, that's all me. That's my fault. Shelly, she just listened and did what I asked her to do to help build the stand. So if it fell or anything like that, I did drill it into the studs in the walls so that everything is stable. We could have an earthquake in Florida, which, you know, rarely ever happens, but we shouldn't have any issues there, and any kids wanted to climb on it or anything like that. I did go through and put in extra 2x4s on the front to make it a little bit more stable, to hold more weight, but all the measurements and math that I did, everything was more than strong enough to hold it up before I did that. It was just a little extra add-ons, but besides that, you know, you can measure out the tanks and put everything together if you want to build the exact stand. If you just somehow have that exact same size wall, because if it was any different of a size wall, I'd probably build the tank stand way differently. So for that reason, I don't share that. But thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you next time.